Hi everyone, I am Raffy Perez. I am part of this year's adjudication core for PIDC. This is going to be a talk about the skill of whipping. So this is part of the PIDC 2024 lecture series. So this is going to be a brief outline of my talk. I will first be giving a description or an introduction about whips and like what the role entails. Second, we will also discuss issue deconstruction. And finally, I will also be giving pointers on whip strategies. So this is just a non-exhaustive list about what whipping is for me. So this is just a list of loose terms or loose metaphors that I use when thinking about or when approaching a whip speech. So first, I'd like to think that whips are fortune tellers. Um, like whips need to have a concrete understanding about the trajectory of any particular debate that you guys are going to have or in any round. So that also entails understanding what the motion asks for, what the paths to victory would necessarily look like, and what issues are central to the debate. So obviously, all speakers ideally within an AP team would also have like that predictive power. But because the constructive speakers will be focused on building the arguments specific to them, then whips need to have that layer of role as well, especially during prep time. Secondly, I'd also like to think that whips are also crafters or scrapbookers. And I also use this for judges, right? And mainly because you guys are the last substantive speakers in a round, which means all of the material um, or all of the materials, may they be arguments or rebuttals, are already there. It is just a matter of organizing them into a logical issue or into a logical discussion that will prove to the judge why you guys win on a particular clash. But that's not to say, right, that like any other crafty person or any other scrapbooker, journaling enthusiast, obviously you have to infuse those materials with your own creativity as well, oftentimes with your own materials too. So, but yeah, that's just one way of looking at it. Like the materials are already there, you just have to organize them. Thirdly, I also like to think that, whips need to also have some construction in their issues. And that's not to say bringing in new matter, but it's mostly about like elevating the already existing discussion to a point that is much more impactful and to a point that is much more persuasive for a judge to give you the win in that round. Fourthly, obviously, like whips need to rebut, they need to destroy. So hence, they are demolishers also. And it's quite funny that I place this as the fourth role instead of the intuitive thing that whips rebut. Because I want to remind people that whips don't just rebut arguments one by one. Or you shouldn't be parroting as well the entire debate, quote unquote, summarizing it into that manner, but rather there is a diversity when it comes to what whips do and how they are able to elevate that discussion, which is the primary end goal anyway of any kind of debate activity. So that's just a reminder. And lastly, of course, whips are also advocates, not just the usual mumbo jumbo of speaking for the voiceless, things like that, because essentially debate is a sport. By advocacy, I also mean that you need to prove to the judge why the discussions that you are launching are the most important ones in the round, given a plethora of materials, as I've said earlier in the scrapbooking part. So it takes a certain craft or a certain art to way off materials, which will also be discussed in a separate lecture anyway. Um, but yeah, it's really part of like what whips do essentially when they launch their issues. Technically speaking, whips need to follow the format or the rules set by, the other governing bodies of debate, like the worlds, or even, if you look at the manual of UADC, and even the rules for PIDC will generally follow the same content. That is, having this list of possible things that whips can bring to the table. So obviously, whips are encouraged to raise new rebuttals or new responses to exist to arguments of your opposing side. This just makes the debate richer and it makes the bench more responsive and more engaging as well. Whips can also launch new explanations for existing material or existing argumentation or even existing rebuttal, which elevates the discussion, but at the same time clarifies to the judge the likelihood of a material being true or untrue if you have these new lines of analysis. Thirdly, whips can also have new defenses. And in conjunction to the fifth bullet, which is having new prioritization, this is where weighing comes into play. Defending your existing material or the likelihood of your existing material, or even defending the falsification of your opponent's argumentation are important tools in a whip's toolbox. Um, of course, like whips can also raise new examples, new demonstrations for existing mechanisms or existing um, like framings from your lines of argumentation. Just because like a whip says a new proper noun or a new name in their speech does not constitute automatically it being new matter, right? So you have to take it into the context of the round. um, is it something completely new or is it something that completely derails the present discussion? And lastly, and importantly as well, in relation to that comment, whips can definitely raise anything that you can expect out of existing material from you from the from the debate thus far. Um, so again, be very careful when it comes to calling out a whip building, because it's in the rules anyway. And whips generally try to avoid it. So be very vigilant when using that strategy. And of course, whips cannot bring new matter into the round because of the virtue of fairness, right? So if a whip brings up new matter, especially up whip, it's going to be unfair for the other side because they have no opportunities to rebut. Um, so the litmus test when it comes to arbitrating whether or not it is new matter or it's something you can derive, aside from carefully inspecting or investigating if it's really something derivable from present material already from the constructives, is to ask, is it something that significantly changes the interpretation of existing argumentation? So if that's the case, then probably it's something that's new, um, or probably it's something that um, merits questioning in that particular round. But generally, if you're a whip, please don't have new arguments, new outcomes, or even new lines of framing that derail the entire round. So be very careful as well and be very charitable or fair to your others, not to your opponents too. So a basic structure for whips, of course, this is a personal style. It was helpful, especially when I was starting out with my training as a whip. So I would generally begin with a few quick clarifications alongside my persuasive or compelling introductory statement. So for quick clarifications, you can set the rules, right? Or you can clarify to the judge and center what the debate really is about, what it's not about. You can automatically weigh off materials that are falling outside of the debate scope, um, and essentially any clarification that you would like to raise. Then I generally move to my extraneous pieces of rebuttal, that is like materials that are outside of the issues that I selected. You can definitely rebut them there. Or if you have glaring things to talk about from the immediately previous speaker, let's say your gov whip and you're responding to DPM, you can place them here. So in conjunction, extraneous rebuttals and quick clarifications and introduction will generally take up one third of my speech time. And the remaining two thirds will of course be about the issues themselves, which should take up the majority of a whip speech. So yeah, my initial issue, sorry, no pun intended. My initial problem when I was beginning my training as a whip also was a complete lack of understanding as to what issue deconstruction is, and like how to even begin like choosing or selecting issues. So we will be definitely discussing that in this next section. So I do believe that issues also have several qualifiers. Firstly, I think that issues are any contention that is elevated in a round. It is any clash that debaters are disagreeing about. And lastly, it's any question that the debate also asks the debaters to try to answer. So obviously for the last bit, right, for the question element, it is something that you think of immediately when you begin analyzing the motion. So just by reading the motion, you sort of have an intuition as to what the issues are going to be. And there's also some variability with how big or small issues can be or can become. So they can be as small or as simple as an issue about characterization, definitions, and framing. Um, Not that they're small, like scope wise, but rather small because they're just focusing on like framings and characterization. So you can see that in a diversity of rooms as well, from middle rooms to bubble rooms to top rooms, etc. Or they can be as big as like macro level impacts or macro level discussions, like an issue about where humanity is going to be better off, or an issue about where morality is going to be upheld, are pretty big discussions that you might want to consider in certain rounds. So yeah, that's just to demonstrate, right, that issues can be big or small, but essentially they're any clash or any question in a debate. So let's take an example. This house would ban the bearing of arms by civilians, which is a pretty classic motion. That's why, it might be easy to process this. So let's see that government argues that, oh, sorry. The scenario is you are a whip and you are observing or like you are trying to develop an issue. Let's say you didn't prep or you're just observing the round, but you are taking the whip role. So let's say that Gov argues that the bearing of arms by civilians led to the rise of pro-guns rights groups, and that rise is actually an active threat to public safety, especially for minorities. Whereas in opposition, the argument goes along the lines of the freedom to carry arms is actually an extension of public safety and is also an extension of a civilian's right to self-defense. So yeah, those are the lines of argumentation. You as a whip can, observe definitely that both sides of the house are trying to debate on a similar outcome or on a similar like trajectory when it comes to impacts. Um, or conclusions in the round. And that is the question, which model protects public safety? So that is an issue, right? So that's just to demonstrate that like how you might want to spot issues if you believe that the pieces of material from both sides of the house are trying to accomplish the same thing or trying to answer the same question. That is definitely a clash point in the round. Age reveal, right? So a shout out to the people who still use clash point as a term. Anyway, so just a brief description as to like what issues might or like how you might want to frame your issues in order to become more persuasive as a whip. So firstly, I do believe that issues need to be processed and phrased profoundly, rather than simply. I mean, there's some simplicity to it, but you have to. There's also an art with how you process, approach, discuss, and even frame the wording of the issue. That's why I searched Canva for philosopher icon and I placed him in the bottom left corner. So for example, in the previous motion about bearing arms as a civilian, um like since debate is also a game of rhetorics, it's going to be more rhetorically persuasive if a whip um like frames their issues to be, firstly, I want to answer a question about whether the state has a compelling mandate to restrict the bearing of arms. And secondly, I want to answer a question about how public safety can be upheld during a time of polarization. So I believe that those two issues, right, they sound much more persuasive than simply saying, firstly, an issue on principle, and second, an issue on pragmatics, which is a completely different discussion as well because, you shouldn't be separating principles and pragmatics in from each other anyway because they go hand in hand. But anyway, that's just to demonstrate that, there's some skill also and there's some art and there's some leeway definitely for whips to be creative with how they phrase their issues. And that is something that judges definitely notice when it comes to persuasiveness. Um, Secondly, I also think that issues are dynamic, hence the wavy, jiggly lines on the top part of the slide. By that I mean it's not true that just because you prepped an issue, you are going to stick with those issues even until the end of DLO. It is true, however, that the debate can completely derail the issues that you prepped during prep time anyway. So be very adaptive and be very flexible. And it's going to take a lot of practice and a lot of time practicing the role of whip. But tracking the round is very important for whips to undertake, and like tracking it, not just tracking them and like writing what the argument is about, but actively processing the requirements for the victory in a round is a skill that you develop over time. And lastly, for the bottom right corner, persuasive issues are generally balanced and fair. It's completely fair for a whip to strategize that you're just going to focus on the issue wherein you have more material in, but focusing on the balanced issues, the actual main questions of a debate, will generally allow you to become much more charitable and hence much more engaging towards your opponents when developing your issue. So yeah, those are just some pointers for how to approach issue setting as a whip. So, how do you exactly deconstruct an issue? I outlined 5 steps. Of course, this is non exhaustive. So, please try to also discover your own style or your own process when it comes to deconstructing an issue. So, I first generally try to select and defend an issue. By defend, I mean try to understand why I chose this essential issue, why I think it is an important thing to talk about in the round, aside from the fact that most of the arguments and most of the speakers spent too much time on them. Next, I will also establish the rules of the issue. That is to say, the standards by which the issue is won, or the win conditions for that issue, and the subsequent effect in the debate for like the effect of winning that particular issue. Third, I then proceed on dictating their side, not really dictating or imposing, but more of understanding what the best form of their arguments are and responding to those best forms of the argumentation. Fourthly, I also embellish our own side, which means you also need to reconstruct, rebuild, especially if an argument from your teammates is actively being questioned and antagonized by the opposing speakers. So you need to embellish them, of course. And lastly, it's to conclude, conclude, conclude. You have to seal the deal, right? Oh, it is, based on my observations, there's a lot of instances wherein whips would just like move on to the next issue without explaining to the judge, number one, why that issue was important, number two, how necessarily the arguments won that issue, and number three, the so what. So, what if you won the issue? What does it mean for the debate? What does it mean for the lasting benefits and for the meta debate at large? So let's go step by step. How do you select and defend? So, for my process, I like to think of questions that I ask myself when evaluating materials or evaluating issues, right? So, for this first step, I ask myself what issues are being clashed on the most, and that is, the one of the easiest and most convenient ways to spot an issue. Next, you can also think of what arguments are lasting on your side of the house and what issues are they answering as well. So, if these arguments are not really responded to by the other side of the house, you need to assess whether your own arguments are important to invoke back. Or should you focus on the larger issues being debated on the most by people? And thirdly, conversely as well, you also need to look at what arguments are lasting from the opponent side of the house that your teammates were not able to adequately or comprehensively destroy and dismantle in their own rebuttals. So that might also give you a picture as to what issues you also need to win on, or at least you also need to weigh off, because those issues might be where the opponents will be winning. Um, and lastly, you also need to um ask yourself during prep time, right? Like, which issues did you predict to be necessary for the debate to be resolved? So these are the main questions of the debate that may or may not guide your argumentation and case building as well during the round. But that's these 4 questions will generally help you in detecting issues in a debate. Obviously, from here on out, when you move on to being or like you when you move on to issue detection in a much more intermediate or advanced manner, the questions then will also change. But I think these 4 questions are a good starting point and would and definitely helped me as well when I was beginning. So let's take the previous example as well. So this house would ban the bearing of arms by civilians. So on face value, you know that because the wording of the motion has the terms arms in it and civilians in it, you know that there is going to be an issue about public safety, an issue on social cohesion, right? And because you know, or because on face value, you also read the motion to include this house would ban, you definitely know that there's going to be an issue about state mandates and justifications for policies, which is the second bullet point here. And lastly, it might take some massaging to do, but you know that in some parts of the world, the bearing of arms is a very partisan issue between, let's say, I don't know, Republicans and Democrats, etc. You know that there might be an issue about polarization in politics wise as well. So those are generally how you not only approach motions but also detect the possible issues in a round. Step two, how do you make rules or how do you set standards for the issue? Um, so for this one, I believe that it requires some sort of inventory when it comes to processing an issue. Let's say the issue is public safety, right? You of course think about who are the involved actors. So for public safety, definitely it's going to be the civilians. Definitely it's going to be the government imposing or employing these laws and policies. Then you move on to answering or trying to investigate what their motivations, incentives, and interests are going to be. Um, so for the actors that I mentioned earlier, their interests are very diverse, but it's mainly a question on if you answer those interests within this issue, what does it mean? Does it mean that you get to resolve the issue better on your side of the house? Um, and that leads to the next sub step, right? Which is like establishing the win conditions for that issue. Is it by reaching a certain outcome? Is that how you answer the question? Is it by proving which outcome is better given the diversity of outcomes and benefits or impacts in a round? Is that how you resolve the issue? Or is it by proving who is most realistic when it comes to characterizing those actors? Is it the one that is going to answer the question, especially in issues of characterization or definition? So again, for example, public safety, the actors are as follows, and the win conditions would probably look like which side proves that public safety is achieved, so that is reaching a certain outcome, or if both sides are able to prove that you reached a certain outcome, you can extend the issue by also analyzing which mechanism is better off. So that sort of engages on the best case of your opponents as well. So again, actively thinking of the win condition, I think, is the main point of this slide. You always need to think of it when processing or when trying to conclude who won an issue, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is something that not a lot of people actively um, state to the judge. So be mindful of that. Step three, dictating your own side. Sorry, dictating their side. So this is like the destructive strategy when it comes to whipping. Obviously, you still need to rebut the current state of the argumentation of the other side before moving on to the much more engaging parts of a rebuttal, which includes the ideal state of their argument. Um, and that is like after that, that is when you still do or add your own level of rebuttal. The main pitfall or the main misconception that I also observe is moving on to the even if rebuttal, right, of the other side, or even trying to neutralize automatically, and essentially the responsive strategy of just saying that is not mutually exclusive is definitely not what a whip only does. There's a lot of ways, or there's a lot of strategization when it comes to what kinds of rebuttals are going to be effective for for a whip to explain to a judge. So please reflect on why the argument fails the win conditions of the issue rather than resorting to the not mutually exclusive response, because that is how you transition from the substantive part of the speech, which is the rebuttals, the rebuilding, etc., to the meta part of the debate. So if you're able to explain to the judge that this argument is false, and also extend by saying that because this argument failed in the round, they cannot win this issue, or they cannot satisfy the win condition of the issue, that is going to be much more persuasive and compelling for a judge to account for. For example, let's say that you are opposition whip, and government side in the bearing of arms debate says that you know, restricting the pro guns rights groups in status quo will definitely protect minorities, right? There are a lot of ways to respond to this following the pathway I highlighted in this slide. So, firstly, you rebut the current state of the argumentation. You can talk about the falsity of the statement, saying you don't protect minorities because minorities are still victims of police brutality regardless. It's not just civilians who bear arms in status quo who have these stereotypical biases against minorities. It's also people in positions of power who can still carry arms on your side. But secondly, if you rebut the ideal state of the argument, the idea that, sure, like these minorities are indeed going to be protected from physical abuse, you can still talk about how anti minority rhetoric will rise only if you like ban the bearing of arms because of that outcome in mind of like protecting minorities, because the narrative becomes it is the minority's fault for a lack in perceived safety from these pro guns rights individuals who might likely be from conservative enclaves as well. So given these two lines of rebuttal, and if the win condition of the public safety issue is reaching the outcome, then opposition whip can then explain that because of the rebuttals, the impacts then or the effects of my rebuttals towards their argument is you increase the level of chaos in status quo. You also increase discrimination against minorities. Hence, public safety cannot be achieved completely. Meaning to say, sure, some moderates or some white people might feel safe, but the most vulnerable, who are often the targets of violence, are definitely not going to be feeling safe. That is why they cannot have public safety on their side. So that is one way of rebutting and explaining to the judge what the rebuttals do for the debate at large. Step four is to embellish your side or rebuild, right? So here you can ask several questions like, what are your arguments? You need to also make an inventory about that. What were the attempts to respond to your own arguments, and why did they fail? Did they lack a mechanism? Did they lack an incentive analysis? And the third question would be, how do you then better reinforce the argument if some of the attempts are successful? So if they respond by arguing a particular incentive of an actor that you argued, you can perhaps like raise a counter incentive or a different incentive, or even argue a different actor that might feel antagonistic anyway. So that is one way of responding to that. And lastly, you also still need to reflect, given your embellished arguments, how do you win the issue? So for example, let's twist it and say that you are gov whip in the bearing of arms debate. Your argumentation is that there is a state mandate to ban. And the reasons that you give for this is that, the potentiality for abuse is immoral for the state to allow. This freedom undermines national security forces as well. And then let's say that OP rebuts this and says that it is unfair to use the potentiality argument or potentiality justification because the abuse hasn't happened yet. You cannot punish individuals for wanting to feel or to exercise their self defense proactively. So the retroactive punishment is something that OP cannot stand for. GovWhip can say that yes, that is true, that you are punishing people who are proactive about their self-defense, but you can bring back the characterization in your whip speech that the majority who owns the guns still benefit from power asymmetries, right? So by virtue of the justification of that issue, like it's pretty easy to also explain to the judge that we satisfy this justification, and opposition does not satisfy this justification because um, they don't account for the realities in status quo. So that is one way of processing an issue as well, based on step four that I highlighted earlier. The last step is to seal the deal. And I cannot emphasize this enough, but concluding an issue is paramount for you being persuasive in explaining that you indeed won the issue to begin with. So you need to analyze and inspect, did you win the issue? If you won the issue, explain why the issue was important for the debate to function or for the debate to be resolved. And if you do not win the issue, which is, sometimes it can be strategic to do this, to like voluntarily lose in an issue, but you still need to explain why the issue was not important at all for the round, right? Or even you can also even answer it in a way that explains that with them winning the issue is harmful for the debate at large. Okay, so that's the final step, I guess, in processing an issue or deconstructing an issue. Okay, so let us try to look at a skeleton of what an issue might look like when arguing in a debate round. So we'll use the same motion as well, and we'll go through the steps one by one. So step one, of course, is selecting and defending the issue. So here you select the issue to be which model protects public safety, and you defend it by arguing or by explaining why public safety is important for societies and states, perhaps talking about how it enables individuals to exercise their other forms of liberties, their other human rights, etc. And you also need to, of course, prove or explain as part of the defense or like setting up the standards and the rules for the round, which is step two, why proving public safety is crucial for your side or even for the other side of the debate. Meaning to say, you can already weigh off like why any other issue becomes secondary or why this issue on public safety is a prerequisite for other issues to arise from the debate. Strategies like those will work. And then step three, of course, is to dictate their side. So here it's just one argument from Gov. Let's say they argue that banning protects minorities from inflammatory rhetoric. And then, of course, that's how you invoke. Then the next step is to invoke the rebuttals of your side of the house. You can talk about XYZ responses from my DLO and LO, but then add your own meta, your own rebuttal, and your own interpretation of the clash and say that this actually leads to increased chaos and discrimination, which means it's going to be bad for society. So that is dictating their side. Step four is embellishing your own side. So you can invoke back the argumentation from up about how status quo equalizes public safety in most cases where there's already minority discrimination. Gov attempts to respond by saying XYZ, but these are false and these are they lack proof from ABC reasons. And that's why the argumentation or like sorry, the rebuttals don't stand, which means the argument from opposition is still valid at the end of the debate. And step five is to seal the deal. So explain as upwhip that because government worsened the issue on public safety, they worsen the outcomes, and because opposition grants a more egalitarian form of security that is much more assured, public safety is much more certain inside opposition, which means the subsequent issues that you will also be discussing as upwhip will only happen, or the argumentation from government side, let's say, will only be valid because of the issue on public safety and because people can still exercise their human rights properly. So yeah, that is like one sample as to how you might want to process a particular issue. Definitely develop your own style, figure out your own tricks up your sleeves and your own trump cards. It's a very beautiful craft to like think of different ways on how to process an issue. There are a lot of logical ways to do it. So it's very exciting, and I hope you guys undertake this arduous process on growth. But that is just my initial approach when I was trying to start out whipping. Okay, so yeah, that is the discussion on like issue deconstruction. The next part, or sorry, the last part of this talk will generally describe what the rules of whips are and some points on strategy. So I put here that whips are active listeners, not only during prep, or sorry, not only during the rounds themselves, but also during prep. And whips literally start predicting the future as early as motion announcements, as I have explained a bit earlier, right? So here, I will be just saying some pointers to do, or like what are the to dos of a whip during certain parts of a debate round. Starting off with prep time. So during prep time, it is very important to do these two steps. The first is to identify what the main questions of the debate are. And again, this is basics of motion analysis, right? But the emphasis also is on whip. So the prerequisite for this task is knowing the basic frameworks and skeletons of how motion types work. This means that you need to understand the mechanics of these motions, which generally will be explained during briefings anyway. But applying them with practice will give you the speed necessary to develop the other parts of the strategy, like at an earlier time or like in a much more efficient manner. So, for example, you know that policy debates like this house would ban something will definitely have a justification issue for the state and a societal effects issue as well. Um, so they're not necessarily the principled issue or a pragmatic issue, because definitely a state mandate issue can have pragmatic and principled aspects, and the societal effects issue can also have those two aspects. So, like it's I do not prefer it to like make those distinctions as well. Or even knowing that, actor motions like this house as a millennial would blah 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 will definitely have an extra issue about which interest is more important for that actor. So yeah, like that's one exercise. Or even like this house regrets debates, right? Having an issue discussing what the realistic counterfactual is going to be. So, yeah, having a grasp on how those issues work is crucial also in guiding your own whip strategy and the strategy of your entire team. And then another step would be to roadmap what the arguments will definitely be. So the prerequisite of it is knowing the basic roles of constructive speakers. So for example, in this house would ban bearing of arms at eme, you definitely know that first exchange should discuss the hard principles and mechanisms in justifying. So obviously, Prime Minister will be discussing why it is necessary and why it is urgent for the state to ban, what the standards of banning are, and whether or not backlash will exist. Versus leader of opposition, you know that they have to clash and counter prop and say that banning is not justified, it is immoral because of self-defense, etc., etc. So, yeah, that's essentially like how you can roadmap what the arguments will be. You can extend this and talk about like what the likely outcomes are going to be for first exchange, what extensions are going to be brought up by second exchange, or how the other whip will be approaching it, which we'll also discuss in a bit. Okay, so during first exchange, um here is the nitty-gritty steps, right? Or the like some strategies to note of. So firstly, you definitely have to detect the accuracy of the setups of both teams. For example, is government defending the policy? And then is opposition correctly rejecting the frame? So, my classical training is that leaders of opposition need to reject the frame. They should not succumb to the framing of the prime minister in order to have a very engaging debate. But yeah, essentially just have that foresight or have that insight when detecting whether the first speaker's setups need some sort of response or need some sort of rebuild from you as a whip also. Secondly, you also need to analyze the model. So model bashing or rebutting the model is indeed part of the debate. You can also think of what your own teammates will be rebutting the model with, because there's a certain expectation also. Like PM has a policy, you expect leader of opposition if they're your teammate to reject the policy and also discuss why the policy is ineffective at large, but still have some reserved lines of analysis if necessary when it comes to rebutting the model. And lastly, of course, interpolate what the extensions will be. So by the end of, let's say, Prime Minister, or by the end of the fourth minute of Leader of Opposition, try to think of what the remaining arguments are likely going to be, because it's really going to help you when you're building your whip speech during the round itself on how you organize the materials and what materials you look out for and what lapses in analytical logic will help your case also. So essentially, the goal talaga of these strategic pointers is to make whipping more efficient and more easy for you. And lastly, during the second exchange, this is where, or this is where you make an inventory already of the materials and the responses. Ideally, by the end of um DLO's third minute is like where you really, really think of like what are the lasting materials, which ones were left unrebutted, which rebuttals were ineffective, and which materials are left standing for you to process. And lastly, you also need to predict how the other whip will approach the last exchange. So, for example, if your opposition whip, is it likely for Gov whip to just spam rebuttals for DLO? Meaning to say, they are unlikely to process the LO arguments, meaning to say they are unlikely to rebuild the lapses of their own materials, which will definitely inform right? Even if it's just like 7 minutes of prep for you. Or conversely, if you're Gov Whip, is it likely for Op Whip to reframe the debate after you rebut DLO? Meaning to say, should you like rebut DLO in a much more concise manner? And consequently rebuild your other materials? Or is it okay for you to spam the rebuttals for DLO? If your foresight or if your intuition says that Upwhip is not able or is not going to be able to completely reframe the debate at that point. And of course, you need to also account for the reply speeches. So, what materials will be used by the corresponding replies, um, which will aid you in precluding them from using those materials against you. So, yeah, those are just some considerations when it comes to the second exchange as a whip. Okay, we've come to the very, very last part of this lecture. It's a brief lecture. But anyway, so this bonus part will be about whip methodologies or like some structures that I have used throughout the years that you might also want to consider when making your own whip speeches. So my belief is that, you have to be very intentional with how you format your speech and some debates not motion types by the way, but some debates that you're actually in will require you to reconfigure the whip speech instead of the basic structure of introduction, issue one, issue two, that's it. So the first kind of methodology that I included here was one that was taught to me by one of my mentors um, when it comes to whipping, and that is to segregate the whip strategy per issue. So it means that one issue will be a destructive issue, typically the first issue you discuss, and the second issue will be the constructive issue, which is the second issue you discuss. Um, so yeah, consider separating the analytical strategies of your whip issues into destroying or rebuttals focused issues and constructing or rebuilding focused issues. This is definitely going to be based on the step two of issue deconstruction, which is making the rules or establishing the standards and the win conditions of the clashes you encounter. For example, you as a whip believe that issue A is very important, and then your team has some unrebutted materials under this that are just like okay or just like moderate or average. But your opponents have very rhetorically persuasive benefits that may sway some judges, even if the arguments are imperfect. So perhaps you focus on rebutting those materials first before bringing back your okay unrebutted materials under issue A. Conversely, on issue B, your team has a benefit that may win the issue and your opponent does not. However, your opponents spam the rebuttals of your benefit. This might make you think that, wait a minute, they're trying to rebut our very good benefit and they don't have their own benefit under this issue. Maybe I should fortify our own benefit or our own impacts and add levels of analysis that will make it more persuasive before calling out them under issue B that, wait a minute, you don't have a counterfactual, which means you're unlikely to win this debate, and just defer that to the latter steps of issue deconstruction. So yeah, it really depends on what the strategy of your other side, of the of the opposing side is also going to be. Okay. Okay, the next methodology is when whips say I only have one issue and many sub issues underneath it. So the my perception is this type of methodology is like often useful for thin debates, which means that there wasn't much elevation or extension by either side of the debate, or this can also exist in very tight and very high rooms when things become a frame battle. So of course consider this kind of methodology if you know that there's going to be a plethora of actors, there's going to be a lot of impacts to sift through, and there's also going to be very different scenarios based on like the possibilities of an actor behaving in a certain way. Let's say the scenario if China is going to invade Taiwan versus if China does not invade Taiwan. You can definitely run both scenarios under issues if the situation calls for it. The caveat, however, is that you need to always conclude each sub-issue and explain to the judge why winning that sub-issue is going to be better or it's going to be more impactful to the overall issue that you presented initially. So yeah, it's right. It's the same with like arguments with quote and unquote five levels. People often forget to conclude and to explain the so what or the meta of those levels. So please be mindful also. And the last strategy, which is my personal favorite, I've tried doing this in several rounds that I've been in. I just call it the kamikaze, because it's essentially structureless, and it relies on your interpretation on how a motion ought to be debated or how an issue ought to be answered. So it's literally how you approach answering a particular problem. So sometimes you will encounter this kind of strategy for higher level rooms, but also for essentially principled debates. And again, this requires a comprehensive understanding of the analytical needs of a question, or like how you approach questioning the debate itself. For example, the motion is this house would forcibly remove women from households where they're subject to violence, even without their consent. So of course you can separate this into like the justification issue and the societal effects issue. But one way is also to begin the analysis of the motion itself by answering the question what the state's mandates are, and then bring back the materials from both sides of the house. Now that you've answered what the state's mandates are, you then proceed with answering the question what then is the contribution of the state to the emergence of violence against women given these mandates, right? So even if the state's mandate under the social contract theory is that they have to protect the rights of individuals, because of certain factors, let's see, the patriarchy or the dominance of religion, of like conservative religions in states, this led to the emergence of violence against women because of a particular belief of like submissiveness, for example. That is how they contributed to this problem, regardless of the state's mandates, rather. After understand So essentially the first two questions is establishing the context of this problem. The next part would be to question or like extend the context a little bit and answer the question what the methods currently are, the attempts of the state to control violence against women and children, and why these methods fail, right? So obviously, after highlighting that context, that the first three sub questions under this methodology would definitely can definitely be a framing argument for prime minister. But anyway, after establishing these three questions, the next question might be, given that current methods are failing and because of the context of the state failure in like not only in the emergence of vow but also in its attempts to control it, why would this policy, or what would the policy be that is going to be effective as a method, or as an adjunct towards the interventions that the state currently has. And then, of course, after explaining the potential effectivity, also talk about the extended impacts to victims, how it's going to affect them, and then proceed on extending that further into the overall societal impacts. So, in the process, of course, you invoke the materials from both sides of the house in terms of processing um, those questions, or like that understanding on how to answer this particular debate. This is sort of an exaggerated list, by the way. I do not launch 6 questions as the analytical needs of a particular motion. Sometimes I only have two, sometimes I only have three. So please don't be daunted. But it's a very exciting methodology because it really relies on your own creativity with how you inspect and investigate how best to answer a question that the debate asks you. All right, so that's the last methodology that I'm going to share as sort of like the bonus part of this lecture. That is also the end of my lecture on whipping. It's very exciting, especially if you like responding, and also especially if you like thinking a lot, and if you like processing problems, because essentially issues are problems in the debate that is going to be resolved by the whip speaker. But even if you're not going to be a career whip, I think it's important to still try out whipping because again, it elevates your debating skills. It gives you a brand new perspective on how to approach motions, as I've discussed earlier with the with the amount of forecasting and the amount of predicting that you have to do in order for you to have a good, compelling, and persuasive whip speech. So yeah, everyone should try it out, even judges, right? Because you also learn the sheer quality of rebuttal necessary for a debater to run or to get away with a certain argument. So yeah, for any lasting questions, you can reach out to me on my socials, or even email me. But I do apologize in advance because I might be in the hospital and I might not see your messages immediately, but I will definitely get back to you if you do reach out. So that's the end of the lecture. I hope you guys learned something from this talk, and I hope to see you guys in PIDC because PIDC is going to be very fun. It's going to be filled with learning, and it's going to be a very bratful experience. So thank you very much, and see you guys in nationals.